Let's say you get a ticket and the ticket is I need a endpoint so that the mobile application can retrieve all of the user's transactions for the past 2 weeks. And you're like, okay, that's the ticket. That's it. Endpoint done. You just pseudocode it. First thing I need to do is I need to write an endpoint and it needs to go in this file and then hit enter. And then next, after it comes back, you check the code. It should be pretty straightforward because it's not very complicated. Should give you, a couple lines of where that endpoint is, name of the endpoint, whatnot. And then you're like, all right, cool. I need to accept two parameters, the user ID and the transaction type. And you're good. And then it'll code it out for you and then just accept. And then you're like, oh, I need authentication for the user ID. And it's like, all right, it'll actually go check application. Hopefully you have some. And then it'll just implement it. It's like, oh, cool. We just, call this function, verify user, whatever, before you actually do any querying and you're good. And then after that, you're just like, all right, pseudocode this query out where you need to find all this transaction type for this user ID, simple join, but you just type it in regular words. So you don't actually have to be good at SQL. And then it's going to come back and it's like, all right, here's the SQL query based off of, your entire application. And you're like, all right, check it. You can check it. If it looks good, cool, run it. Always run your queries. If you're not running your queries, what are you doing? Especially if it's a read. And it's like, all right, cool. It works. Sends all the data back. And then it's like, oh yeah, I want the data in JSON. Structure it in JSON, to JSON, whatever. And then you're basically done. It's not that complicated. You don't need to do very much like guesswork. You just need to make sure in your head, your mental model, the steps it takes to get the functionality built out is very clear and you're typing it in one at a time. And then make sure that the code works. Be careful the LLM doesn't like do some extra stuff where it's like, oh yeah, I also added this for, whatever reason. Like it might do that sometimes, but just check that. And that's kind of like the basis of where you start. Once you kind of get the hang of it, then you can actually go and do more advanced things where you can kind of like chain these things together. Where it's like, oh, give me an endpoint that takes in user ID and transaction type and gives me all the transactions for the past 2 weeks. Make sure it's in JSON. And you can try that. And it's like, all right, it might take a little bit longer. But once you kind of get the hang of it, you can start exploring and trying things out.